Um, okay, so this is section 4 of this lecture. I'm talking about corporate war here. And Herr is going to talk about this, but I want to start with uh, probably the most famous, no doubt about it, actually. It is the most famous statement about the enmeshing of government and military producers of military technologies, chemicals, anything military, basically. Clothing, foodstuffs, tanks, trucks, bombers, you name it. All kinds of things that we don't think of as being, this also has to be sourced for the military. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is play a clip from Eisenhower's farewell speech, where he is going to talk about, for the very first time, anybody is going to use the words military industrial complex, MIC as it's just called, but usually military industrial complex. Okay, so let's watch Eisenhower. Okay.
Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Okay, so now that's Ike, and you can see how different the presentation is between then and now. I mean, I don't just mean sort of in the fact that the picture is smaller and it's black and white, but that look at the language, that Eisenhower uses. It's elaborate, these complex sentences. So when people say, "Oh, we're not as not intelligent, but we're not as say well educated as we used to be," it's like, well, maybe there's something to that. So this is I picked up the piece of the speech, which is the most famous. And the thing about Eisenhower is that he's not a particularly good speaker. He sort of is everybody's granddad, and he had this very grandfatherly. He was kind of everybody's granddad, and he is like his style, his personal style was like he wore cardigans and he went golfing, and people were like, oh, they liked Ike. So he says, this is the famous piece, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence. Like, wow, this sounds like a piece of high theory, whether sought or unsought by the military industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Okay, now it is typical to have a farewell address at this time. And so he's going out, Kennedy's coming in, right? As Kennedy's being sworn in. And what Eisenhower does as he's leaving after 2 terms is he identifies what I consider to be, and what many consider to be, the most serious problem that outside of race relations, which is also brutally serious. I mean, it's like which one is worse? Race, class, or gender? Take a number. They're all bad. But this is a class issue, and nobody escapes that, right? I think if you're a white person and you have enough money, you can get away from race. And if you're a powerful woman, you may be able to get away from it. Not so much at this point, but later on, you may be able to inoculate yourself against some of the problems that gender is going to bring about. Some of them, but boy, nothing's going to inoculate you against this particular thing. So let's take a look at this in the councils of government. Okay, so in the halls of government, where people talk, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence. All right, so what we have is, say, somebody from Boeing or Raytheon or Grumman or Lockheed, big military manufacturers, who come to government functionaries, whether they're civil servants, that is people who are not elected but are hired to work in the government, or whether they are hired, whether they're Congress people and senators and so on. And remember that each state has its own Congress and its own Senate, right? So that there are these little tiny there are little versions. The governor, this is why the governors are so powerful, because the governor effectively is the president of the state. And then there's a Senate and there's a Supreme Court in the state. So the structure is replicated. The federal structure is replicated at the state level in the same way that in the Canadian system, each province replicates what the federal government is doing, basically, without the Senate, probably. Okay, so you've got people who are in business, and they are going to have influence. Okay, so we're just going to hold that in advance. Whether sought or unsought. Okay, so does somebody come to you or do you go to somebody? By the military industrial complex. All right. So we'll take somebody who works at Raytheon, let's say, somebody who works high up at Raytheon, like the president of Raytheon. And the president of Raytheon makes a call to somebody high up in the Defense Department and says, hey, Jerry, let's go to Las Vegas and have a vacation. And Jerry says, that sounds good, Tom. So off they go to Las Vegas, and Jerry lays on, say, some prostitutes and a bunch of expensive liquor and, whatever else the Tom wants, basically. And then at the end towards the end of the weekend, Jerry says, we really would like it if your department would buy our very fine Lockheed missiles of the certain variety. And Tom says, well, Jerry, that's open for a tenure, for a contract call. It's open for tender. And so, we're gonna take. And Jerry says, yeah, but Tom, you and I have already gotten along, and we'd really like it if So Jerry starts to work on Tom, and Tom starts to feel, and he says, well, what's it worth to me? And Jerry says, well, maybe after you've done another 5 years at the government, you'd like to come and work for us at Lockheed. And Tom says, well, yeah, what kind of position might I have? And Jerry says, well, you could be a vice president, and you get a position on the board. That comes with 2 homes, one in Miami Beach, and so on. And so Tom says, I like the sound of this. I think we'll take this to, I'll make sure that we steer the contract towards you. Multiply that by thousands. And you've got people who are from the military, that is from the military industrial complex. That is, they are working in industries which make military stuff, and it may be guidance systems, it might be missiles, it might be guns, it might be helicopters, it might be uh, the, the the raw bodies for helicopters, it might be the material that you're going to need to make the wing structures in a Phantom fighter or something like that. Or maybe you want you own the fastener industry, and you want people to use your rivets, and or you want to build something, you want to build a new factory, and the military is looking for, the Navy is looking for a place to start a shipyard, and you would like to start a shipyard in your state. So you go to the military and you say, to a provider, and you say to the Navy, who are you thinking about, having take up this new contract? And they're like, well, so and so boat builder is going to probably get our contract. So you go to so and so boat builder and say, well, what would it take for you to come down to Georgia? We have some very fine deep water harbors. And they're like, well, we prepared to go to Georgia if the conditions are right. Like, for instance, what would the tax situation be like? And you're like, well, I'm right at the moment writing a tax bill, and I can write a nice tax bill for you that you don't appear in it. So this is the beginning of the fusion, which occurs during World War II, really, where the military, industry, and government get into this three-way mangle, basically, and to the point where people go back and forth between one to the other. So, for instance, Robert McNamara, who becomes one of the principal architects of the middle part of Vietnam, where the escalation is happening, comes from Ford, is my memory of it. And he goes from Ford right into the government as an organizer and as the secretary, my memory is the Secretary of Defense. And he is going to oversee the beginning of the bombing of North Vietnam, plus the escalation of it. And it's basically going to break him. He's going to, yeah. I mean, he says he doesn't, but it's arguable that he has a nervous breakdown at the point that he leaves the White House in 1967 and is sent to the World Bank by LBJ. But he's broken. He seems to be a broken man. Now he recovers and then writes extensively about this. But people went back and forth across these lines. They went from Raytheon into the Pentagon, and then they went into the government, and then they went back to Raytheon. And there was this sort of revolving door of people going from one place to another. So here's Eisenhower, who was himself a general, the top general, remember, from World War II, right? It says we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence. So what kind of influence are we talking about? The influence of the military industrial world. So people who make military stuff on policy, tax structures, where you're going to build, who's going to say what. If they say, well, we don't like unions, can you, GA might say, we're not fond of unions, we'd like to move over to, say Idaho here and start a plant. We just don't want to have it unionized. Can you make sure that doesn't happen? And people in Idaho are like, we're so glad to have a factory. This is great. What do you need? We'll make it happen. Whether it's sought or unsought. So do you come, Ike is focused on the government, right? So he's like, did somebody come to you or did you go to them? So did you say, as a senator, let's say, hey, I'm open for business, or did somebody come to you and say, are you open for business? By the military industrial complex. Now, this is the first time anybody will use this phrase, and it's just so important because now this is basically what runs war. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. And Ike was absolutely right. The the change, the shift. This is why people don't feel that when they vote, they're actually putting in the people in power. Because what they're doing is they're voting for somebody who is attached to major corporations, and they're going to do what major corporations tell them to do. And whether or not they can actually do that, whether if they say, well, my tax structure is going to be blah, 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 it's like, well, it's up to Bechtel, or it's up to IBM, or it's going to be up to Amazon as to whether or not, there's going to be a decent tax structure, because these, old, big, high-tech companies are effectively part of this is the way America makes war. Okay.